Back to war, again, Iran and the United States are headed back toward full-scale war. But if you've been listening closely to what America's own commander-in-chief has been saying for months, you'd be well within your rights to think that something doesn't add up. Here's a small sample of what President Trump has said about this conflict since it began. On March the 7th, speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, he said the U.S. had wiped out Iran's Navy, 44 ships, and that Iran's missiles weren't coming much anymore. 6 days later on Truth Social, he wrote that the United States was totally destroying the terrorist regime of Iran, militarily, economically, and otherwise. By late April, after the naval blockade went into effect, he was telling reporters the war was very complete, pretty much. And then, months later, in an interview on Fox News, he casually mentioned that Washington had actually left Iran's military alone, because wiping out an entire country's armed forces tends to leave nothing behind for the next 40 years. We could keep going. There's plenty more where that came from. But you get the idea. According to the man in charge, Iran's military has been erased, resurrected, erased again, and then quietly spared, all within the same several months. And somehow, through all of that, Iran and the United States are once again on the edge of full-scale war. If Iran's navy really was sitting at the bottom of the Gulf, if its air force really didn't exist anymore, if the war really was very complete, pretty much, back in April, there'd be no reason for anyone to be bracing for a return to open conflict right now. Something in this story isn't adding up, and today we're going to walk through exactly what that something is. A quick caveat. Before we get into it, we need to be upfront about what this episode is and isn't. There's a genuinely large gap between the war that's actually played out across the Middle East over the past several months and the version of that war the White House has been selling to the public. We don't have unlimited time today, and any one of the points we're about to cover could realistically be its own full episode if we wanted to dig all the way to the bottom of it. So consider this an overview, not the final word. If there's a specific thread here you want us to pull on properly in a future video, tell us in the comments. We do actually read them. With that out of the way, the easiest place to start when trying to understand the gap between wartime reality and Washington's rhetoric is with a bias that's quietly shaped how a lot of people have come to understand this entire conflict. That bias treats tactical victories as if they were the same thing as strategic success. And even among analysts who are the most critical of how Washington has conducted this war, there's broad agreement that the tactical side of the ledger has genuinely gone well for the United States. American air power established near total dominance over large parts of Iranian airspace. Thousands of military targets have been hit. Nearly every direct order issued by the commander-in-chief has, in a narrow military sense, been carried out. On a purely tactical level, meaning the individual battles, strikes, and short-term military actions, the United States has performed about as well as any modern military realistically could. The problem shows up the moment someone takes that mountain of tactical wins and assumes it automatically adds up to strategic victory. It's an intuitive mistake to make. The logic seems obvious on its face. America has inflicted this much destruction on Iran's military, so how could Iran possibly not be defeated? Except that question actually has a legitimate, uncomfortable answer. As long as Iran remains both willing and able to pursue its own strategic goals, and as long as its leadership chooses not to stop fighting, Iran has not been defeated, no matter how lopsided the scoreboard looks. And the scoreboard, to be fair, really is lopsided. American losses sit at roughly a few dozen troops and a handful of aircraft. Iran has lost thousands of personnel and the overwhelming majority of its conventional military hardware. That imbalance is real, and it's exactly the kind of statistic that gets quoted constantly by an administration that benefits politically from playing up the scoreboard. But a lopsided scoreboard doesn't come with a built-in mechanism that forces the losing side to capitulate. There's no switch that flips once the casualty count crosses some threshold. Iran's leadership still has what it needs to threaten shipping through Hormuz, strike targets across the Gulf, and maintain its grip on power inside the country, which are precisely the strategic objectives it actually cares about. And right now, that leadership remains willing to absorb an extraordinary amount of pain to hold onto those objectives. Washington can keep running up tactical wins indefinitely. That alone was never going to be the thing that forces a strategic change of heart in Tehran. The air war. Start with the tool America has leaned on hardest: air power. The U.S. Air Force and the carrier-based air wings of the Navy are, by any honest measure, the most capable in the world, flying the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet alongside a deep arsenal of cruise missiles, strike drones, and a growing stockpile of long-range loitering munitions modeled in part on some of Iran's own designs. Washington has genuinely achieved air supremacy over large stretches of Iranian territory. Iran can still take potshots with its own drones and missiles, but the sky, in any conventional sense, belongs to the United States. And yet the U.S. is running straight into the limits of what air power can actually deliver. In modern warfare, air dominance functions a lot like a cheat code. If you have it and your opponent doesn't, You get an enormous, often decisive advantage. But even with the cheat code active, you still have to finish the game, and there's only so much a single advantage like this can accomplish on its own. A reconnaissance aircraft can spot an Iranian missile launcher rolling down a highway. It cannot see inside a mountain tunnel to know what's stored there. A strategic bomber can flatten a building or a base. It cannot sift through the rubble afterward to figure out what equipment or what commander actually survived. A cruise missile can be flown directly into a building where a senior Iranian official is believed to be. It cannot confirm the kill, and it cannot go hunt that official down if he walks away. Even after months of a dominant air campaign, Iran can still stockpile and launch missiles and drones more or less at will. It can still send fast boats out to harass commercial shipping. It can still restock, reposition, and rebuild. American strikes have absolutely made a difference. They have not produced a surrender, and there simply aren't many new ways left for aircraft alone to apply additional pressure that they haven't already tried. If Washington genuinely wants to force Iranian capitulation, the tool that's actually capable of doing that is large numbers of troops on the ground. And that is one of the most politically toxic options available to any American president. Doubly so for one who campaigned explicitly on ending, not starting, exactly this kind of entanglement. Iran appears to be betting that when that moment of truth arrives, the political cost of a ground deployment will outweigh Washington's appetite to pay it. Which means Iran's entire strategy comes down to demonstrating again and again that anything short of boots on the ground simply isn't going to be enough to make it fold. Missiles that won't stop coming. None of that strategy works, of course, without the weapons to back it up. And despite the repeated claims coming out of Washington, Iran has managed to preserve many hundreds of missiles and an uncounted number of long-range drones, along with the ability to keep building more. A lot of this comes down to how Iran actually stores its arsenal. Many of the country's most valuable weapons sit inside so-called missile cities, reinforced underground tunnel networks purpose-built to survive exactly the kind of bombardment America has thrown at them. Even the most advanced American bunker-busting munitions aren't fully up to that task. These tunnels are engineered to collapse around a missile rather than on top of it, dispersing blast energy so that even after a direct hit, weapons can often be dug out largely intact. Iran hides its production infrastructure the same way, spreading out the components, fuel, and assembly work across many small, redundant sites, rather than a handful of large, easy-to-target factories. Destroy one facility, and there are reportedly a dozen or more just like it, scattered elsewhere in the country. To actually end Iranian production, the United States would need to find and destroy dozens of dispersed sites faster than Iran can stand new ones up. And so far, that math simply hasn't worked in America's favor. The way Iran uses these weapons matters just as much as where it hides them. Tehran knows Washington has excellent satellite coverage capable of spotting an exposed launch before it happens, so Iranian forces spread their equipment across as many improvised launch points as possible, fire in small batches rather than one large barrage, move different weapon types together in ordinary-looking civilian vehicles, and favor rugged terrain or dense urban settings that are harder to isolate from the air. The doctrine even has a name: shoot and scoot. Stay mobile until the moment of launch, fire as quickly as possible, then relocate before a retaliatory strike can land. That single habit has let Iran repeatedly dodge the kind of follow-up strikes that would otherwise wipe out launch crews and vehicles for good, preserving capacity for the next round. There's also the money question sitting underneath all of this. None of that rebuilding happens without financing, and Iran's oil trade with China, funneled through a shadow fleet of tankers, ship-to-ship transfers, and shell companies designed to scrub any trace of Iranian origin before the crude reaches a Chinese refinery, has kept enough revenue flowing to fund exactly this kind of reconstitution. It isn't the pre-war level of income by any stretch, but it's been enough, according to multiple intelligence assessments, to get drone and missile production lines back up and running within months rather than years, even after strikes that Washington described as having eliminated the overwhelming majority of the country's defense industrial base. And underneath the financing question sits an even simpler one: the basic economics of the fight itself, which have never really favored the side trying to intercept everything rather than the side trying to launch it. A single American Patriot interceptor runs somewhere around $4 million and can take the better part of a year to build given how complex its supply chain is. An Iranian attack drone in the Shahed family, by contrast, can reportedly be assembled for as little as $20,000 using mostly commercially available parts, on a production timeline measured in days. Multiply that gap out across a sustained campaign, and the math simply does not work in Washington's favor. Iran doesn't need most of its drones to get through. It needs to get lucky once in 100 launches, or once in 1,000 to force expensive interceptor use, tie down air defense crews, and keep pressure on shipping and bases alike. American and allied forces, by contrast, have to be right essentially every single time, indefinitely, against an opponent that can absorb losses and keep manufacturing the cheap option faster than anyone can replace the expensive one. That asymmetry alone explains a lot about why a devastating opening air campaign never translated into the kind of decisive, lasting advantage the scoreboard would suggest it should have. Sponsor break. Insert subscriber site or partner read here before returning to the analysis. Retaking the Strait. Move past the air war and you land on the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that was open and toll-free when this conflict started, and one that Trump and his allies have repeatedly vowed to reclaim. As of today, America hasn't managed to reopen the strait to normal commercial shipping, and it hasn't come particularly close. Start with the plainest reason why. America's naval forces simply aren't positioned to force the strait open directly. The U.S. Navy remains the most powerful in the world by a wide margin, but being the most powerful isn't the same as being able to meet every demand at once. Ships need to be pulled for maintenance and training. Naval assets already committed to the region are tied up protecting existing U.S. and allied positions. Turning any meaningful fraction of that force into an offensive tool to physically retake the strait means finding capacity that, by most independent estimates, Washington simply doesn't have available in theater right now. The naval blockade itself gives a sense of how strained things already are. Since it went into effect in April, CENTCOM has reported roughly 85 vessels intercepted and a handful of ships seized, while outside shipping trackers like Lloyd's List have counted more than 24 vessels that slipped through anyway. The U.S. has claimed the blockade is costing Iran somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 million a day, with the Pentagon separately estimating several billion dollars in lost Iranian oil revenue within the blockade's first few weeks alone. That's real pressure. It is not the same thing as control of the strait. And even in a scenario where American warships did try to force their way through, those vessels wouldn't be squaring off against conventional Iranian warships or aircraft. They'd be facing the same combination of missiles and small, fast, hard-to-track boats that every other ship in the Gulf has had to deal with throughout this war. A warship is a single, large, relatively fixed target with only so much capacity to shoot down incoming fire before its defenses are overwhelmed, and operating that close to the Iranian coastline means dealing with artillery and rocket fire on top of everything else. One estimate floated earlier in the conflict put the naval escort requirement at roughly a dozen major surface warships just to safely move a convoy of 10 commercial vessels, a ratio that gives you a sense of just how far short of what's needed. America's current regional deployment actually falls. You'd think American allies might step in to close that gap, especially after Trump spent months publicly criticizing countries like Britain, France, Japan, and South Korea for staying on the sidelines earlier in the war. But those countries have consistently declined to commit naval assets, and not without reason. Several of them simply don't accept Washington's underlying case for why Iran posed the kind of existential threat that justified this war in the first place. Others lack the naval capacity to meaningfully contribute without putting older, underpowered ships into an extremely dangerous, high-tempo combat environment they have little recent experience operating in. Being a U.S. ally doesn't function as a blank check either. NATO, for instance, is a defensive alliance, and its members, the United States very much included, launch military operations all the time without expecting the alliance to automatically follow. There's a clear mechanism for pulling NATO into a conflict like this one, invoking Article 5 on the grounds that Iran attacked a member state directly, and Washington has notably chosen not to go down that road, likely because the argument would face serious skepticism even among close allies. Then there's a piece of this that rarely gets explained clearly, which is how strait security actually functions from a commercial standpoint. Shipping companies don't decide to send a vessel through a dangerous waterway just because the U.S. Navy promises protection. Every commercial voyage carries insurance, and insurers price that coverage based on the real probability of an attack. When that probability spikes, so do premiums, often to the point where running the strait simply isn't worth it financially, regardless of what security guarantees Washington offers. These are not smugglers willing to gamble a single vessel on a risky run. They're enormous, risk-averse conglomerates with no appetite for anything outside the normal course of business. What might make tactical sense to a military planner, accepting that a few ships out of 20 might get hit so the rest can get through, makes no sense at all to a shipping company that has to answer to its insurers and its shareholders. Clearing that bar, convincing entire fleets of commercial operators that the strait is genuinely safe again, requires a level of sustained, demonstrable control that the current American naval posture in the region simply isn't built to provide. It's also worth pointing out that even America's more creative attempts to route around this problem haven't gone especially well. Earlier in the war, Washington floated the idea of reflagging and escorting convoys directly, an approach with real historical precedent going back to the tanker escort operations of the 1980s. But pre-war Hormuz traffic was running well over 100 transits a day, a volume that no realistic naval escort operation, then or now, was ever built to sustain. Even the ships that made it through those 1980s convoys did so with mixed results, including a supertanker that struck a mine on the very first run and a U.S. warship that was nearly sunk under similar circumstances, against an Iranian military that was, by any measure, far less capable than the one Iran fields today. If the escort approach struggled against a weaker Iran operating a handful of scattered mines 4 decades ago, it was never going to be the answer against a version of Iran that has spent years specifically preparing to make exactly this kind of operation as costly as possible. The Navy that's gone and doesn't matter. Which brings us finally to the Iranian Navy itself, a force that Trump, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and other officials have repeatedly claimed to have wiped off the map. And to their credit, that part is largely true. The United States really did destroy the overwhelming majority of Iran's major surface warships, along with its naval headquarters. Reported figures from the opening weeks of the war put Iranian vessel losses somewhere in the range of several dozen ships sunk within the first 2 weeks alone. For all practical purposes, Iran doesn't have a functioning conventional navy anymore, and it will likely take many years before Tehran can field a new frigate, corvette, or attack submarine to replace what it lost. The problem isn't that Washington lied about destroying Iran's navy. The problem is that Washington has repeatedly presented that fact as though it were the thing standing between Iran and defeat. As we've just walked through, Iran has kept commercial shipping out of the strait and sustained its blockade largely by manipulating perceived risk, not by threatening anyone with conventional warships. Instead, Iran leans on exactly the tools that survived the initial onslaught, swarms of small, lightly manned fast boats too numerous to fully track, capable of harassing tankers, planting explosives, and carrying out boarding operations. It leans on drones, launched from the air or skimming across the water's surface, and on missiles fired from mobile, dispersed positions. And it leans on a modest but meaningful minefield scattered through the strait, enough that a commercial vessel can do everything right, avoid every drone and every missile, and still be damaged or sunk simply by striking something submerged and unseen. So it's entirely true that the United States has destroyed the Iranian Navy. It's also true that doing so has had remarkably little correlation with actually reclaiming the Strait of Hormuz, which was always the point that actually mattered. A country that's broke and still won't quit. There's one more piece of this contradiction worth sitting with before we wrap up. Because it isn't just that Iran's military has proven more resilient than advertised. Iran's entire economy has been genuinely devastated by this war, and the regime has kept fighting anyway, which is arguably the harder half of this puzzle to explain away. The numbers here aren't in dispute the way military damage assessments often are. Iran's currency has lost the majority of its value since the war began, at one point cratering more than 10% against the dollar in a single day, and eventually settling around record lows. The IMF has projected Iran's economy will contract by more than 6% this year, with inflation climbing toward 70%. Average monthly incomes have reportedly fallen to somewhere near $200 for a lot of ordinary Iranians, and that's before accounting for food prices that have roughly doubled year over year. Iran's own state media has floated war-related reconstruction costs north of $250 billion, a figure that would represent more than half the country's entire pre-war economic output. By any conventional read of how economic pressure is supposed to work, a country in this position should be desperate to make a deal, any deal, that gets sanctions, relief flowing, and the bleeding stopped. Instead, Iran has repeatedly walked away from exactly that kind of deal, including one that would have unfrozen hundreds of billions of dollars in exchange for reopening the strait. That's not the behavior of a government being run purely on economic logic, and it's a piece of the story that the tactical versus strategic framework helps explain too. For Iran's current leadership, particularly the younger, more hardline officials who rose to power after the original leadership was killed in the war's opening hours, control over Hormuz was never primarily about economics in the first place. It's treated as a matter of regime survival and deterrence. Folding under pressure, even catastrophic economic pressure, would signal to every faction inside the country and every adversary outside it that the Islamic Republic breaks the moment enough force gets applied. And for a government that has built its entire identity around defiance for nearly 5 decades, that risk is treated as more dangerous than a shrinking GDP figure, which is really just the tactical versus strategic gap playing out one more time in a different arena. Washington has scored an enormous tactical win against the Iranian economy. It has not yet produced the strategic outcome that win was supposed to guarantee. The pattern underneath all of it. We could keep going. There's a lot more of this gap between Washington's rhetoric and the actual state of this war that we haven't touched on today. Why the Iranian public hasn't risen up against its own government. Despite everything it's endured, why the White House's legal justification for continuing this campaign rests on shakier ground than officials are willing to admit. Why the specific casualty and damage figures coming out of CENTCOM briefings so rarely line up cleanly with what independent analysts and intelligence assessments are finding months later. If there's a thread here you'd like us to pull all the way through, tell us in the comments, because we genuinely do read them, and this is exactly the kind of feedback that shapes what we cover next. For now, though, the through line connecting everything in this episode is the same one we opened with. Tactical success and strategic success are not the same thing, and an administration that keeps conflating the two, sometimes within the very same news cycle, ends up producing a public record that simply doesn't hold together. Iran's navy was destroyed within weeks, and it didn't matter, because Iran was never fighting this war with its navy. Iran's air defenses were overwhelmed and its skies were lost, and it kept launching drones anyway, because drones were never meant to survive contact with American air supremacy. They were built to be cheap enough and numerous enough that losing most of them was always the plan. Iran's declared production capacity was gutted by more than 80%, according to Washington's own figures. And within months, intelligence assessments were describing a defense industry rebuilding faster than anyone had planned for, because the parts of that industry that actually mattered were never the parts sitting in the easiest places to bomb. None of this means the war has gone badly for the United States in a narrow military sense. On the metrics that show up in a press briefing, ships sunk, targets struck, sorties flown, this has arguably been one of the most tactically dominant air campaigns in recent memory. But a war doesn't end when one side wins every individual battle. It ends when one side loses the willingness or the ability to keep fighting. And by that measure, 6 months and multiple contradictory victory announcements later, Iran hasn't gotten there yet. Washington is now bracing for the possibility of a return to full-scale war against a country it has, at various points, described as annihilated, moderate, spared, and pretty much finished, sometimes all within the same season. That's not a sign of a war that's over. It's a sign of a war whose actual status has never quite matched the story being told about it. We live in an exhausting media environment, one where most people simply don't have the time to sort competing, confident-sounding claims from the truth, and where an endless stream of sources promise they alone have the real picture. We get to spend our time trying to find that picture because of viewers like you, and speaking honestly from where we sit. The confusion around wars like this one is very often not an accident. It tends to serve somebody. Thank you for watching. And if you want a little less confusion in your feed, you know where to find us.